The Super Dreadnought Arizona, latest addition to the United States Navy and the largest and most powerfully armed fighting ship ever built at the Navy Yard in Brooklyn, went into commission at 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon, while the Blue Jackets from half a dozen other dreadnoughts, the Yard staff, and a large number of civilians looked on. Rear Admiral Nathaniel R. Usher, Commandant of the Yard, during whose administration so much government work has been done there, read the orders from the Navy Department which made the Arizona an active unit of the Atlantic Fleet, after which Captain John D. McDonald read his own orders from the Navy Department to assume command of the Super Dreadnought. Then the band struck up the Star-Spangled Banner. A big new silken flag was hauled aloft, and the Arizona was in active service. For weeks past, the crew of the Arizona had been assembling, most of the men coming from the battleships Kansas, Vermont, and New Hampshire, 3 ships of the pre-dreadnought type which were transferred recently to the Atlantic Reserve Fleet. The Connecticut, the sole remaining vessel of the pre-dreadnought type, now in the Atlantic Fleet, is destined to go into the reserve. The Atlantic Fleet has been reorganized so far as its first fighting line is concerned into an all-dreadnought fleet, and by this time next year, when the new Idaho and Mississippi go into commission, the fleet will form one of the greatest naval fighting forces in the world, with 13 vessels of the dreadnought class comprising the 4 active battle divisions. "Do you realize," said an officer of the Arizona yesterday, "that this one ship has more big guns than the Kansas, Vermont, and New Hampshire combined? And that a broadside from the Arizona's 12 14-inch guns weighs 6,000 pounds more than what a broadside from all the 12-inch guns on those 3 ships. Naturally, we got our crew from those 3 ships. The Arizona is too big and important to risk a chance with a green crew, and the only sensible thing to do was to give us a trained crew, and the only place to get those men was out of active fleet. And as those 3 ships were going into reserve, where they belong, they furnished a majority of the men." In the yard yesterday, when the Arizona went into commission, were the dreadnoughts Wyoming, Flagship, the Delaware of the 5th, the New York and the Texas of the 6th, and the Arkansas, Nevada, and Pennsylvania of the 8th Division of the Atlantic Fleet. These are the first-line fighting divisions of the Great Fleet under Admiral Mayo. Divisions 1, 2, 3, and 4 are their reserve organizations. In addition to the wonderful main battery of 12 14-inch guns, the Arizona also mounted 25-inch guns and a full battery of anti-aircraft ordnance. In the opinion of the Navy officers, she and her sister ship, the Pennsylvania, are the 2 most powerful vessels of the dreadnought class in any navy in the world. No other vessels of the Atlantic Fleet mount so many guns of the 14-inch type. The New York, Texas, Oklahoma, and Nevada each mount 10 14-inch guns. On all other ships, the big guns are the 12-inch caliber. It was said yesterday that the Arizona was still about 150 men short of her full fighting complement of 1,084 officers and men. These men, however, will be provided shortly, and when the ship goes to sea a few days hence, she will be manned to her required limit. The entire turret force of the battleship Kansas, among them some of the best marksmen and gunners in the service, are a part of the Arizona's crew. Following her launch, the USS Arizona was towed to the Brooklyn Navy Yard for the fitting out process, receiving her major components such as her guns, cage masts, and other important infrastructure. Once she was ready, she would be commissioned on October 17, 1916, almost 1 year and 4 months following her launch. She would be placed under the command of her very first in a long line of captains, Captain John McDonald. A month later, on November 16th, following her cleanup by the crew, the testing of her propulsion systems, and the declination of her magnetic compasses, she would depart from New York for shakedown training off the Virginia Capes and Newport before proceeding to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. While outside Guantanamo, a stripped turbine forced her to travel back to New York for repairs on December 7th. At this point, I must place a sliver of my own personal opinion into this retelling of the ship's history. Not to look too deeply into the timing, but it is perhaps only foreboding in historical hindsight that this specific occurrence took place at this specific date. The Arizona would arrive back at Norfolk on December 16th, where she would enter Chesapeake Bay for a torpedo defense exercise in Tangier Sound. Around the same time, she would get to test out her main and secondary gun batteries from December 19th to the 20th. She would then return to her builder's yard on Christmas Eve for a post-shakedown overhaul. As for the original reason for her arrival, the turbine itself couldn't be repaired while it was still within the dreadnought. As a result, the workers at the naval yard cut holes through the upper decks in order to lift the damaged casing out of the ship. It would later be reinstalled after Arizona had spent nearly a quarter of a year's worth of time receiving repairs and alterations. On April 3, 1917, she would depart from the yard and would arrive the next day to join Battleship Division 8. On that very next day, April 4th, the United States would enter the then almost 3 years old First World War, or as it was known at the time, the Great War. The US would come in on the side of the Allies, including countries and empires such as France, Great Britain, Russia, Italy, and Japan. The US would throw itself and its military forces against that of the Central Powers, including Imperial Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. The Senate would approve the resolution declaring war on Germany by a vote of 82-6 on April 4th, while Congress gave its own approval to the resolution 2 days later. America, for its part, would quickly begin preparing its existing naval power for the conflict ahead. This would include its lineup of dreadnoughts such as the Arizona. For Arizona herself, she would not participate directly in the following battles of the war. Heading overseas directly to Europe would instead fall to her older, coal-burning relatives in Battleship Division 9, including USS Delaware, USS Wyoming, USS Florida, and USS New York. Due to Arizona's nature as an oil-burning ship, a resource that by that point had become critically scarce in the British Isles, she would have to remain in home waters. She would take up a more defensive role by sticking close to American shores as part of Battleship Division 8, operating out of Norfolk throughout the course of the conflict. She would also serve as a gunnery training ship for crewmen on armed merchant vessels that were a part of the Atlantic convoys. In fact, not long after the US entered the war, 8 of her 5-inch guns, the 4 guns farthest forward, and the 4 sternmost guns were removed in order to be utilized by the merchant ships that needed them most. She would also patrol up and down the waters of the eastern seaboard from the Virginia Capes to New York. In so doing, she would occasionally sail near the wreck of the old San Marcos, formerly the USS Texas, where she would sometimes use as target practice for her 14-inch guns. The threat posed by Germany's U-boats kept Arizona from sailing too far into the Atlantic, only doing so when accompanied by fellow battleships and escorts. Aside from training, the crew of the Arizona also found time for recreational activities, such as participating in the famous Battenberg Cup, a rowing competition between the crews of American and British ships. Her raceboat team would go on to win the cup against their rivals from the ship's older cousin, USS Nevada, in July 1918. Arizona's crew would likewise go on to win the competition in the following year of 1919. At the conclusion of the war and the signing of the armistice on November 11, 1918, the Arizona would leave a week later from Hampton Roads in the United States, before arriving in Portland, England on the 30th. She would then leave from her berth at Portland Harbor after another 2 weeks, and sail on towards France where, on December 13th, she would join a group of 9 other battleships and 28 destroyers. This was no ordinary fleet either, but a presidential convoy. Within its ranks was the SS George Washington, a German-built civilian ocean liner used by the US to ferry troops to Europe at the outbreak of the war. Now on its deck was President Woodrow Wilson, who was on his way to the Paris Peace Conference, a set of diplomatic meetings that would dictate the terms of peace for the defeated Central Powers and have consequential results for the rest of the early 20th century. The American Battleship Division joined President Wilson's ship at 5 o'clock this morning, providing one of the few naval spectacles in many months. The vessels maneuvered with lights, and the sight was an inspiring one. Long before daylight, the battleship Pennsylvania, leading the presidential convoy, picked up by wireless the vessels approaching from the north. The night was partly cloudy, with the moon visible now and then. Suddenly, the Pennsylvania got a series of rapid signals from a destroyer hovering off on the skyline, and began signaling. With the searchlights pointing a long, illuminated figure into the sky, she wrote a message in flashes on the big black clouds. In a few seconds, the answer, written on the sky by the battleship away over the horizon, began to come back. Then the top lights of the fleet came over the curve one by one and stood by the president's ship, which proceeded on her way until daylight, when all the ships in the convoy spread out and fell into their appointed places on the right of the line of formation. The battleship Pennsylvania was at the head of the center column, having on either side a line of destroyers, then a line of 4 battleships, then a line of destroyers on the extreme side. The battleship Wyoming, with Vice Admiral Sims on board, headed the line on the left, followed by the Utah, the Oklahoma, the Nevada, and the Arizona in that order. The line on the right was headed by the New York, followed by the Texas, the Arkansas, and the Florida. After a presidential escort mission was finished, Arizona would take part in a procedure that would act as a foreshadowing of the mass repatriation of veterans to the US at the end of World War II, known as Operation Magic Carpet. She would embark 238 returning veterans heading to the US before sailing from Brest on December 14th, starting the return journey to New York along with her sister ship and the rest of her cousins in Battleship Divisions 6 and 9. The battleships would arrive off of Ambrose Light on Christmas Day. The very next day, Arizona would join them in passing before Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniels for a naval review. Though the weather would prove anything other than clear that day, the Secretary looked on from the yacht Mayflower near the Statue of Liberty. Arizona was the first in line and gave a 19-gun salute to Daniels. Both her and her fellow super dreadnoughts would enter New York Harbor to the reception of a great homecoming celebration. Along with many of the other members of the recently returned fleet, she would anchor off New York City for the next several weeks and remain open to the public. As January 1919 rolled in, the battleship then sailed back for Hampton Roads on the 22nd, before returning to her base at Norfolk on the 23rd. On February 4th, Arizona would leave Hampton Roads, sailing south for Cuba, specifically for Guantanamo Bay, arriving on the 8th. She would spend the bulk of her time conducting training and participating in fleet maneuvers, which, to the delight of the crew, also included a Liberty visit to Port of Spain, the capital of the then British colony of Trinidad and Tobago. As mentioned before, 2 months later, in April, Arizona's rowboat crew would go on to win the Battenberg Cup for a second time in a row, pun intended. Shortly after her crew's victory against their fellow sailors, the Arizona would set out for France, now on another escort mission for President Wilson. Wilson was preparing to return to the United States from the Paris Peace Conference. However, while awaiting the president's departure, rising tensions in Turkey forced her to redeploy to the city of Smyrna, now the modern-day city of Izmir on the west coast of Turkey. At the time, the region was in the midst of serious socio-political upheaval. Following the end of the First World War, the Ottoman Empire was abolished by the signing of the Treaty of Sevres, which obliged Turkey to renounce all rights over Arab Asia and North Africa. The Western Allies, particularly then British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, had promised territorial gains to Greece at the Ottoman Empire's expense if Greece entered the war on the Allied side. These gains, among other locations, included parts of western Anatolia around the city of Smyrna, an area that contained sizable ethnic Greek populations. This was all despite contentions by Italy that Smyrna was a part of their allotted territorial gains in the wake of the war. As a result of being at loggerheads over the Smyrna question, both the Greek and Italian governments would send naval warships to protect their interests, these being the Greek Pisa-class armored cruiser Giorgio Savarov and the Italian Andrea Doria-class battleship Duilio. The United States, for its part, would send their own battleship, USS Arizona, which left Brest Harbor on May 3rd, bound for Asia Minor. She arrived at the city of Smyrna 8 days later to protect American lives. This would prove to be a smart move, as Greece would show its hand shortly after Arizona's arrival. Greek ground forces arrived in transports and landed at the port of Smyrna on May 15th. The occupation of the port would be violently resisted by gunfire from Turkish nationals. Arizona would quickly take on her new role as a point of refuge, the sheer bedlam in the city created by the Greek landings, causing many American citizens in the area to seek shelter aboard her. She also provided temporary shelter for a party of Greek nationals. At the same time, the battleship's Marine detachment guarded the American consulate. A number of American citizens remained on board until conditions permitted them to return ashore. When the crisis was over, Arizona departed from Smyrna on June 9th, sailing for Constantinople. The battleship carried the United States Consul at Large, Leland E. Morris, to that port. However, what she would leave in her wake would be the beginning of a bloody 3-year-long conflict between Greece and Turkish national forces. The war would ultimately lead to the defeat of Greece, the abandonment of the Treaty of Sevres, and the creation of the modern-day Republic of Turkey, or to be more accurate, Turkiye. Arizona's part in this piece of history, however, was now over. She sailed home from Constantinople on June 15, 1919. Preceding via Gibraltar, she arrived 15 days later at the New York Navy Yard on June 30th. There she would receive an overhaul that would see the modernization of her fire control system and the removal of 6 of her 5-inch guns, a procedure that would anchor her in place for the remainder of the year. The coming of the year 1920 saw her sailing once again into the Caribbean to join Battleship Division 7 for winter and spring maneuvers. She would return to Guantanamo Bay that same January for crew training and would be fitted with a flying-off platform 2 months later. In April 1920, the winning streak of her rowboat crew would finally come to an end. They would lose the Battenberg Cup to their long-standing rivals from the crew of her cousin ship USS Nevada, who would win the competition that year for the first and only time. During this period, Arizona also visited Bridgetown, Barbados in the British West Indies, and Cologne in the Panama Canal Zone before sailing north for New York, arriving there on May 1st, 1920. Departing New York on May 17th, she operated on the southern drill grounds and visited Norfolk and Annapolis before returning to New York on June 25th. Over the next 6 months, the ship operated locally out of New York. Aside from being present at the Naval Academy's graduation ceremonies in June, nothing else significant would happen to Arizona until July 17, 1920. That day, she would receive her now famous alphanumeric hull designation BB-39. Come August 23rd, she would become the flagship of the commander of Battleship Division 7, Rear Admiral Edward W. Eberl. Eberl was a high-ranking naval officer with a well-established reputation for gunnery and contributions at various institutions of the Navy. Arizona would be refitted for the role set for her by the Rear Admiral later that year. January of 1921 saw Arizona leaving New York to join the fleet of 6 battleships and 18 destroyers sailing for Guantanamo Bay and the Panama Canal. They arrived at Cologne on the Atlantic side of the Isthmian Waterway on January 19th. Arizona would transit the Panama Canal for the first time that same day. She and her crew would arrive within the waters of Panama Bay on the Pacific side the very next day. 2 days later, the fleet set off for the city of Callao, Peru, after meeting up with the Pacific Fleet, reaching their destination 9 days later for a 6-day visit. While there, the Arizona hosted a visit from the then president and de facto dictator of Peru, Augusto Leguía. Leguía had thrown a military coup in 1919 that had secured his second term in the country's Palacio de Gobierno, or government palace. Arizona had arrived in the 3rd year of Leguía's El Oncenio de Leguía, Leguía's 11-year rule, which itself would be ended by another coup. The two combined fleets would practice battle maneuvers before the Arizona made a short return trip, heading for the Panamanian city of Balboa on February 5th. Arriving on the 14th, she would once again transit the canal on the 20th. Almost a week later, she was back in the Atlantic, within the familiar waters of Guantanamo Bay. She remained in operation there until April 24th, when she traveled north to her home of New York via Hampton Roads. She would remain there under overhaul until June 15th, when she steamed south for Hampton Roads. June 21st saw a bit of a diversion from her usual activities of international travel and fleet exercises. On that day, she would be operating off Cape Charles in Northampton County, Virginia. She would be present along with Army and Navy observers to witness the experimental aerial bombing test set against the ex-German submarine SMU-117. The U-117 was a Type UE-2 long-range mine-layer submarine of the Imperial German Navy. The submarine had caused more than its fair share of headaches for shipping in the American coastal zones. She had sunk or damaged some 24 Allied, but mostly American ships, altogether sinking approximately 27,459 tons worth of shipping, just 2,000 shy of Arizona's own weight. The armistice had caused her to be surrendered and turned over to the Allies. America had chosen her as one of 6 former German subs it would use for its Victory Bond campaign before she would be taken out to sea to serve as a target. Arizona's crew got to watch as 3 Navy Felixstowe 5FL flying boats sank her with 2 salvos of 163-pound, 74-kilogram bombs. Returning to New York on July 1st, the battleship's crew would there break the flag of Vice Admiral John D. McDonald, who had served as Arizona's first commanding officer before its later succeeding captains Josiah McKean, John Dayton, and William Phelps. Taking Phelps's place as commander of the super dreadnought would be Jehu V. Chase. Chase was a veteran of the Spanish-American War and the adventures of the Great White Fleet. He also possessed an experienced captaincy spread over 2 decades, which included vessels such as the torpedo boat Whipple, the Monitor USS Tallahassee, and the Connecticut-class pre-dreadnought battleship USS Minnesota. Notably in the latter case, he was in command of the battleship when she struck a German mine in September 1918 while traveling off the coast of Delaware. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal for successfully managing to steer the Minnesota back into port. That is, after the mine had blown a 30-foot-long hole in her underside. It should also be noted that this very same mine had been laid by SMU-117. This was the same captured German submarine that Arizona's crew had just watched being bombed a few weeks prior to Chase's arrival. Now with her new captain, Arizona would sail south for Panama and Peru a little over a week later. She reached the port of Callao on the central coast of Peru on July 22nd as the flagship for the battle force of the Atlantic Fleet. The force had arrived to observe the celebrations accompanying the centennial year of Peru's independence, as well as to deliver a special embassy. On July 27th, Vice Admiral MacDonald went ashore and represented the United States at Plaza San Martin in the city of Lima. There he was present for the unveiling of a monument commemorating the accomplishments of San Martin, who had liberated Peru from the Spanish Empire a century earlier. This monument still stands in that very same plaza to this day. Sailing for Panama Bay in early August, Arizona was appointed as the flagship for Battleship Division 7, when her old captain, Vice Admiral MacDonald, transferred his flag to the older dreadnought, USS Wyoming. Around the same time, Rear Admiral Josiah S. McKean broke his flag on board as commander of the division on August 19th at Balboa. The following day, Arizona sailed for San Diego, arriving a day later. From here, the battleship would begin operating from her new home port of San Pedro, a neighborhood located within the South Bay in Los Angeles, California. She would remain based there until 1940. For the rest of the 1920s, Arizona's service consisted of routine training exercises as well as participation in the annual fleet problems beginning in 1923. These were meant to simulate large fleet actions by having the majority of the active fleet facing off against one another. The first 4 problems for 1923 and 1924 would focus on simulating attacks on the Panama Canal from the west. Fleet Problem 4 would move away from this, however, with a heavier focus on simulating offensive amphibious operations against Japanese forces, such as those on the island of Okinawa. The following year in 1925, Fleet Problem 5 would be aimed at simulating the defense of the Hawaiian Islands, with other problems later on including the Caribbean and the West Indies. On July 27, 1923, Arizona, then under the command of Captain John Y.R. Blakely, took part in a naval review in Seattle being conducted by then-President Warren G. Harding. The 29th President of the United States would die just 1 week later, and on August 3rd, Arizona would join the Pacific Fleet in firing a salute in his honor. In early March of the next year, 1924, Arizona would become embroiled in a scandal. Before she had left New York, a prostitute by the name of Madeline Blair had stowed away aboard her with the help of some of the crew, trading sex for a free voyage to San Pedro. That is, until she was discovered on April 12th, while the ship was anchored in the, by then, familiar waters of Balboa, Panama. Her journey having been cut short halfway through, Blair was transported back to New York City. The ship eventually reached the Bremerton Navy Yard to begin her refit. There, Captain Percy Olmsted, who had taken command of Arizona since November 29, 1923, took this time to convene a court-martial for 23 sailors involved in the case. In the end, sentences including up to a decade of imprisonment were handed out. Commander of the battle fleet, Admiral Henry A. Wiley, issued a letter of reprimand to all of Arizona's officers. This would even include a certain ensign by the name of R.L.A. Burke, who would later go on to become an admiral and Chief of Naval Operations for the Navy. Admiral William V. Pratt, then in command of Arizona's Battleship Division, disagreed with the penalties handed out by Wiley and deemed them too excessive for the crime in question. He would go on to remember this case in particular. After achieving the rank of Chief of Naval Operations for himself in 1930, he would order the reprimands stricken from the officers' records almost 6 years after the incident. In January 1929, Arizona was involved in Fleet Problem 9, which was meant to study the effects of a potential attack on the Panama Canal. However, this would prove to be unlike any other fleet problem before it, namely due to the eye-catching number of naval elements and assets involved. These forces represented a significant commitment of the total US Navy, with 72% of the fleet's battleships, 68% of its destroyers, and 52% of its modern combat aircraft involved in the scenario. In a risky move, the aircraft carrier, USS Saratoga, was detached from the attacking fleet. She successfully launched a 70-plane strike, which destroyed 2 locks and rendered the canal inoperable. Despite being sunk 3 times earlier in the day, and perhaps in a case of double-sided foreshadowing, this exercise proved the versatility of a carrier-based fast task force. A month later, on February 7th, Arizona transited the Panama Canal for Guantanamo Bay, where she operated through April. From there, she proceeded to Norfolk Navy Yard, entering it on May 4, 1929, to prepare for her modernization. Given the passage of time and the progress being made in naval technology, by now the old ship was in serious need of a few renovations. She would be placed in reduced commission on July 15th, and would remain in the charge of the Navy Yard for the next 20 months. Her by then iconic cage masts were removed. In their place were set new tripod masts, surmounted by 3-tiered fire control directors for the main and secondary armament. The number of her 5-inch guns was reduced to 12. The remaining guns were repositioned 1 deck higher, most likely in response to the old issue of the guns being inoperable in heavy seas by virtue of being too close to the water. 8 25 caliber 5-inch anti-aircraft guns replaced the 3-inch guns with which she had been originally equipped. Such changes increased her overall crew to 92 officers and 1,639 enlisted men. The ship's main gun turrets were modified to increase the maximum elevation of their guns to 30 degrees. In tandem, her 2 submerged torpedo tubes were removed. This was done with the expectation that future battleship engagements would be conducted at even greater distances, making such shorter-ranged weaponry virtually redundant. This consequently allowed the large transverse flat in which the tubes had been situated to be subdivided so as to reduce the risk of flooding. Her deck armor was increased by the addition of a 1.75-inch, 44mm thickness of special treatment steel. The ship was bulged to protect her from torpedoes, and an additional bulkhead was added to the sides of the boiler rooms for the same purpose. The compressed air catapult on the quarterdeck was replaced by one that used black powder. Meanwhile, below deck, her high-pressure turbines were replaced by more powerful cruising turbines from the cancelled battleship Washington. 6 new boilers replaced her original ones. The added power offset the ship's increased displacement, which bore fruit during her sea trials. She made 20.7 knots, 38.3 kilometers per hour, or 23.8 miles per hour, with 35,081 shaft horsepower, 26,160 kilowatts, at a displacement of 37,654 long tons, or 38,258 tons. She would finally be placed back in full commission again on March 1, 1931, ready to resume her service as a renewed and reinvigorated battleship of the US Navy.